Okay, welcome back. Hope you all had a very nice lunch and are not too full to continue the conversation and the discussion as we have today. My name is Julie, and I'm from a Danish NGO, and I will be facilitating the plenary session for this afternoon. And all of you know that we're a bit late, so there's a bit of change within the time schedule. We still have a very good 20 minutes of keynote. We will shorten our working group and also the end and the conclusions today. So that means that we will start at 3 o'clock with the groups. Then you have to decide yourself if you want coffee, but you have to be back here 4:30. So you self-organize coffee, but that will be around 4 o'clock. You can get coffee if you think it's important for your work. So yeah, that's still at the in the same place as in the morning. So and then in the end we will have a very short overview from the different people who have been rapporteurs on what have happened in the different workshops. But a short intervention from the 6 working groups. But at first, I'm very happy that I can present Albena Asmanova to present her keynote address to us. Albena is a professor at Brussels School of International Studies at University of Kent, and has been publishing award-winning analysis of precarity and the rise of populism. And what is really good for the discussions today is that she has experience with a successful political struggle, and underline the successful, which I think is important to draw upon that knowledge as well. And she has been involved in the dissident movement against the dictatorship in Bulgaria, where she's from as well, and has later organized campaigns against rule of law violations in Europe. So very happy to present you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay, you can hear me actually. We have all had our lunch, and then we can ask that great question. Who do we think we are when we come together and demand to be heard? We're a bunch of strangers united by at least one idea. There is no invisible hand of democracy. We are the very visible feet and fists of democracy. And as Christophe Aguiton reminded us this morning, we have achieved quite a bit. However, our struggles have been crippled by a pandemic of precarity. In my work, I have discussed precarity as a very special type of vulnerability rooted in the insecurity of livelihoods. That gives us fragility that is experienced as incapacity to cope and fear of losing social status. Precarity is feeding a longing for stability and is making us afraid of change exactly when change is most needed. So the anxiety that precarity generates has instead fueled far-right, xenophobic populism that calls for instant security with law and order measures that aspiring autocrats are very happy to deliver, as we have seen happening everywhere in Europe and beyond. So to empower civil society for a systemic change, as the job is ours today to figure it out, we must understand this new enemy of progressive politics, precarity, and learn how to fight it. Here is how. 2 features of precarity merit particular attention. First, its political origins. So we cannot be told that modern life is complex and risk is everywhere and we should just build in resilience. No. we have to fight the political drivers of precarity, and second, that it has become of massive scale. I will be saying we don't have a precarious class, we have a precarious multitude, and that changes the terms of political engagement. So first, precarity is politically crafted through specific policies, politics, and ideologies. Around the turn of the century, I will be telling a story that you have heard actually, but it's good to remember to see what's important in that story of the development of the neoliberal capitalism. So around the turn of the century, as competition in the global marketplace intensified, competitiveness became the top policy priority across Europe and beyond. For the sake of competitiveness in the global race for profits, public authorities not only privatized public assets, slashed social spending, reduced employment security, but also struck sweetheart deals with global corporations against the mantra of competition. So while public authorities sheltered some actors from competition, the competitive pressures on all increased, except on a handful of mega players who reap the benefits of digitalized economies of scale. All this has resulted in the proliferation of work-related pressures across social class, so also capital as well as labor, professional occupations, and income levels. In short, the combination of automation, globalization, so global market integration, and cuts in public services and social insurance has generated massive precarity for ordinary citizens, for men and women, young and old, skilled and unskilled, for the middle classes and the poor alike. As live worlds and livelihoods became thus destabilized, our societies became extremely vulnerable, even as they recovered somewhat from the 2008 financial meltdown and currently from the COVID pandemic. Now, precarity is both ubiquitous, it's everywhere, but it is also strongly stratified. So we have to talk about inequalities of precarity or the stratification of precarity. It is, of course, much graver for minorities, immigrants, and other disadvantaged groups, but it is important to acknowledge that it now affects also people upwards the social ladder. So some of the purported winners, those who the journalist Alyssa Quartz had called the middle precariat, a professional class composed of university professors, nurses, administrators, lawyers, caregivers, even bankers who, we've read that story about Goldman Sachs bankers pleading for their work week to be capped at 80 hours. That's a source of precarity. So I claim that precarity is now transversal injustice, cutting across all other forms of social harm. So we don't have a precarious class, we have a precarious multitude. But it's also important now to add one more element in the description of the enemy, precarity as an enemy, to understand it better. Where does this sense of failing to cope come from exactly? I believe it is rooted in an increase of responsibilities that are not matched with the capacity to carry them out, or misalignment between responsibility and power. This is what is creating precarity, as governments are increasingly offloading responsibilities onto individuals and societies. Very often, that is even done with the label of more democracy, but as the American philosopher Wendy Brown has pointed out, this simply means offloading large-scale problems such as unemployment and environmental degradation to units, individuals, companies, citizen communities that are poorly equipped to cope with them. So people are not so much free as forced to be in charge of their life. Okay. Responsibility without power makes us feel precarious, unable to cope. Another important point to remember is that precarity harms not only individuals' material and psychological welfare, but it also hampers society's capacity to manage adversity and to govern itself. COVID pandemic, great example. Our affluent, politically sophisticated, scientifically very advanced societies could not cope with a virus that was neither very unknown or very deadly, but they were not prepared because the healthcare systems were weakened. Now, let me now address the very serious political consequences of precarity. It is, as I said, it is changing the terms of political engagement, and this is what we need to understand. It puts us in a state of perpetual crisis management and breeds a longing for safety and security. So that, on the one hand, deepens what is known as the tyranny of the present, right? In context of uncertainty, worries about the end of the month inevitably, decidedly trump concerns with the end of the world. You know what I'm referring to, the Yellow Vest protest. More generally, precarity fosters conservative and even reactionary attitudes, as people are afraid of change, even though discontent with the status quo is also very clear to them, very distinct. So precarity, in that sense, I believe, is at the root of the puzzling upsurge of populism in liberal democracy in the late 20th century. Much before, we have this rise of electoral support to populist parties before the 2008 crisis. This is what often analysts forget, that this kind of protest started to mobilize in conditions of good economic growth, low unemployment. So how come? Usually populism erupts in conditions of crisis. But the 80s and 90s were exactly the time when the social consequence of neoliberal globalization started to be felt. So people felt their livelihoods threatened, even if they had not lost them yet. So whether old parties like the Front National in France or new ones like Pim Fortuyn in the Netherlands, they voiced these broadly shared public concerns with four things, and that is the new agenda of public concerns: physical, political, economic, and cultural vulnerability. Now, we should also do well to remember that the populist party's anti-establishment stance does not translate into a comprehensive reform agenda. They rely on shortcut fixes of security. They're often led by chauvinistic nostalgia, so this is not an inspiring utopia. And here, precarity is likely to trigger this kind of reactionary political instincts, especially when a positive social utopia is missing, that is charting a clear way out. And this is the situation now because due to the failed experiments in my part of the world with socialism and communism, these utopias, positive utopias, are discredited. Another political consequence is the rise of electoral autocracy. If we described precarity as responsibility without power, it's coupled very easily with the opposite, with power without responsibility. You have autocracy. The next political consequence, as anxiety about preserving one's social status now haunts all social groups, social solidarity is deeply eroded. Now, the middle classes have traditionally championed the interests of the poor, as those are less politically active. Such solidarity made possible the post-war welfare state, whose robust social safety net needed significant transfers. However, the middle classes are now abandoning the poor. The working classes are once again turning against immigrants for fear of job loss. Remember the Polish plumber thing. 20 years ago. Precarity has aggravated the tension between the local and the global solidarities, as Calypso Nicolaides reminded us earlier today. So the local social justice agenda is in direct clash with the global social justice agenda, as parties are split between worrying for our workers versus, the jobs that are lifting the lives of other workers. So this is a grave problem for the left. Finally, probably the most alarming consequence of precarity is that it is politically debilitating. It deprives us of agency because it directs all of our efforts at finding and stabilizing sources of income, leaving us neither the time nor the headspace for battles about the kind of life we want to live. Now, the question of our gathering. How can democratic civil society drive systemic change in such circumstances? I have 7 ideas. First, we need to drop the wishful thinking that is haunting much of the left. We need to be realistic. We cannot plausibly urge people to prioritize the end of the world concerns over the end of the month worries. Nor should we believe that electoral democracy will solve much. As the Italian elections most recently displayed, elections tend to channel into policy the conservative and even reactionary preferences that contemporary capitalism generates. Second, we must admit that populist movements have valid grievances rooted in acute precarity. It is the articulation of these grievances, the autocratic shortcuts to stability, that demagogues offer that are the problem. And in my writing, actually, I have urged that we drop altogether the label populism because it's very misleading. We have a new agenda of public concerns. We cannot just shuffle these eruptions of discontent into the old left-right map of electoral mobilization. Okay, third idea. In order to break the alliance between the right and the far right, the left needs to develop a language to address the injustice of instability. Now, stability, order, safety have traditionally been values espoused by the political right, the conservative parties. So they seem to hold monopoly of that, although they couldn't care less about our stability. But they have a monopoly of the political language. So the left has made instead inequality the center of its discourse, and inequality is a grave concern as well. But I'm suggesting that we need to develop a language with which to address this very broadly shared concern with instability and longing for stability. Okay. To address the insecurity as a proper issue of social justice. Fourth, it is not enough to demand economic and political stability. The very sources of precarity, all these policies and politics that I listed, the political ecosystem built around the profit motive. Basically, this is what we ultimately need to eliminate. So not to put the band-aids, but to remember what is driving precarity and fight that. So, of course, our struggles need to start from very specific grievance, specific harm, but they should seek to strike at the systemic roots. And we have a few very good examples of that can be played out. The George Floyd uprisings of 2020, they started with a very narrow grievance that the black minority is targeted by police violence. And then that narrative was enlarged to say, we reject police violence in general and oppose the use of law enforcement as a substitute for social integration. So basically, the George Floyd protest ended up rejecting a system that actively generates social decay and then resorts to violence to cope with social disorder. For me, that was a radical social critique. Fifth, building alliances with strange bedfellows, with the enemy if you wish, in the sense that we need to point out that the grievances about precarity, let's say the grievance of the labor market insiders who are working 80 hours a week, and the grievances of the long-term unemployed who cannot even get a chance to enter the labor market, they have a common root. So we, as activists, we should try to explain these common roots of seemingly conflicting grievances. Okay. Because to fight precarity in this way, it would create the enabling conditions for agency that has been blocking us. Or to take the example of the clash between the environmental and the social justice agenda. They are in tension. A powerful capital labor alliance is blocking progress on ecological justice, let's admit it, for fear of job loss, for fear of loss to competitiveness of businesses. However, if we replace the current focus on inclusive prosperity, which the left has embraced, inclusive prosperity means we have to grow and redistribute and destroy the environment further, so it's a no-go. If we replace that with a focus on economic stability, we might have a better chance to reconcile the social justice agenda and the ecological justice agenda. Sixth, let us steer clear of utopias. How many minutes more? 3? Okay. All right. Although a wide mobilization against precarity will be akin, as I have argued in my last book, Capitalism on Age, it will be akin to a radical systemic change, even an anti-capitalist subsurgence, overcoming capitalism. Because precarity, in my analysis, is generated by the intensification of the profit motive. We do not have to lead our battle with any grand labels of anti-capitalism, socialism, or whatnot. Being accountable to real people with real problems not only creates urgency, but sparks creativity and generates staying power. So what I'm saying, let's not get bogged down into labels and into seeking a unifying utopia. We might lose a lot of creative energy there. Let's be specific in paying attention to people's concerns, but keep our attention to fighting the sources of precarity, because capitalism is at the bottom of that story. And last, 7, we must engage democratic innovations. I said that the electoral democracy has become a problem, but there are democratic innovations that can bring in a solution, because such democratic innovations can generate the empowering awareness of a certain logical transition, and that is a transition that individual experiences of harm are in fact systematic occurrences with systemic roots. So individual, systematic, systemic. What kind of democratic innovations can show us this? Transparency, accountability, very much in the spirit of what Calypso Nicolaides has designed as the democratic panopticon. I believe that, it both can keep us accountable to each other, aware of each other's concerns, and get this sense that my grievance is a systematic occurrence, and then there are clever people to tell me what the systemic roots of that grievance are, where we come as activists and academics. So, to conclude, democracy is surely what we Democrats make of it. As I have argued in Capitalism on Edge, right now we have a very tangible, very unique, precious chance for effecting radical change without the crutch of grand utopia, revolutionary break, or even without the terminal crisis of capitalism, because capitalism is doing very well. We're suffering, but capitalism is all right. So we can do all that simply by fighting precarity on all fronts, in all shapes. Because we cannot think big if precarity is preventing us from walking tall. This is from me.